Yeah.
Sure, that's fine.
Right.
Hello, folks. Welcome, welcome. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to give people a couple more minutes. I know that I always have some people who join slightly on the dot, and then we can get started. In the meantime, please feel free to access the chat. I will be posting some links in the chat, especially for those of you who are going to be requesting CUs. So please make sure you can access the chat and feel free to say hello and where you're from. I know that sometimes people don't have access to the chat on some devices like mobile phones and so on. So that's why I want to make sure you guys can access everything okay on your end before we get going. Hello, West Yorkshire. Hello, London. Hello, Zagreb, Croatia. Oh my, oh my. Hello from Jordan. Hello from France. Ah, there we go. We have an Italian. I was wondering. I'm like, surely my neighbors are gonna show up.
Ciao.
Hello, everybody. Hello. Okay, so let me get started. Welcome, everyone. I'm Thanos Bostanis. I am a lecturer at the Tizard Center at the University of Kent. And at the University of Kent, we do research in supporting individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and we focus on improving their quality of life. As part of our work, we offer courses, and our courses are postgraduate, or master's courses in autism and intellectual disabilities, and in applied behavior analysis and positive behavior support. And we have both campus-based and distance learning option. Now, I work with the ABA PBS team. I'm the director, the program director of the Masters in Applied Behavior Analysis and Positive Behavior Support. And as part of our work, we try to disseminate good practice in our field to folks all around the world due to the online nature of our Tizard Behavioural Talks. Now, those of you that don't know about Tizard Center, we also have a peer-reviewed journal that focuses on individuals with a learning disability or an intellectual disability. If you're outside the UK, you might be using that term. So we always welcome submissions from folks that work with these populations. So I will put some links in the chat to draw your attention to our website and the journal for those of you that might be interested in either one or both. I will also deliver 3 keywords for those of you that are collecting a CU. So make sure you note those down. And during the talk and at the end, I will post a link to a Microsoft form, and that's where you're going to add your information and the 3 keywords. And I will then, in due time, email you with your CU certificate. So today we welcome Dr. Francesca Degil Espinosa, and she is going to be talking about a verbal behavioral analysis of theory of mind. I'm sure you've read the bio, so I'm not going to read that to you again, but I will ask Francesca to tell us what she's currently working on. Then, Francesca, you take it away, and I'll be in the background supporting. Thank you.
Thank you. So currently, I'm mainly working on writing a couple of conceptual papers, as well as my usual work of working with families of individuals with autism, mainly young children. The families generally come here. You can see a child just left my room, and so it's a bit of a mess. Yeah, I have a couple of students currently who I'm in their supervisory committee for their PhD, and hopefully that will result in some additional applied papers. So in the past few years, I've published a few things on question discrimination, a couple of procedures that have been successful, mainly with master students. I do not hold in a formal academic post in a university. I'm generally just called in as a bit of a helper consultant for current students. And I do a lot of training of professionals. So that continues to be my passion, is teaching kids and teaching adult students to teach kids. So those remain my main interests. Let's get started, shall we? And I should say, actually, I forgot, this paper is nearly finished. I need to add a few references, and it will be submitted very soon as part of the conference offerings from the Theory and Philosophy Conference from ABAI that was done in Chicago. So see how it's received, if it's accepted, but hopefully it'll come out at some point. So I'm going to get started. Some of you may have heard this topic from me before. Is one of my sort of favorite topics. My main interest is to providing behavioral translations of cognitive processes, which is something that isn't done enough as far as I'm concerned. But I trained originally as a cognitive developmental psychologist. That was most of my schooling. And then I sort of, alongside my degree, I worked as a tutor for kids with autism in the 90s, and then moved on to do a sort of ABA-based PhD at the University of Southampton. But theory of mind has always been a big topic for me, mainly because my tutor at university was John Swettenham, who was a colleague of Simon Baron-Cohen, and a sort of part of that group of cognitive psychologists who were really pioneers of this view, of this interpretation of the human mind, let's call it that. And I remember going into his office and explaining that I was tutoring a child with autism using what at the time was called very much behavior modification. And he said he was really, really pleased, but he thought that we would never be able to teach theory of mind. And I left it for about 20 years because I just didn't have the verbal repertoire to tackle this topic from a behavioral standpoint until I learned quite a lot more about verbal behavior. I was lucky enough to be mentored by some great people, one being Dave Palmer, who really taught me about multiple control. And about 15 years ago, I sort of picked up this topic again. And it has taken me a very, very long time to clarify my thinking on it. But I've been presenting on it for the past few years. And I think it's got to the point now that I can deliver it in an hour, in just under an hour. And I think I'm at the point where I can explore, I believe verbal behavior analysis can explain sort of the basics, can translate and explain the cognitive view of this phenomenon. And the question isn't so much whether theory of mind exists. First, we need to define what it is. It's not a theory of the mind per se. It's not psychological theory per se. It really is about people having a theory of what goes on in someone's mind, right? So when we talk about theory of mind, we're talking about the child develops at some point, generally around the age of 4, a theory about what goes on in someone's mind, and an understanding that what happens in someone's mind, sorry, I just lost my screen. What happens in someone's mind leads to action. So the average child is able to predict one's action based on mental states. This is, in a nutshell, the sort of mainstream view. And of course, as behavior analysts, this kind of proves a bit of a challenge because we don't start from the premise that mental states cause actions. Actions are under the control of controlling variables. So a behavioral view of theory of mind generally must lead us to understanding, well, what is the behavior that the cognitive experimenter is testing when they're saying they're demonstrating theory of mind? Most importantly, what are the controlling variables for the behavior of the child who is said to demonstrate theory of mind? So these are my aims today, is first to review the mainstream definition. And I think this is important. I think we need to start from where the mainstream psychology is. And to, rather than try and behaviorize the term and change it into perspective taking, and believing that by just changing it to perspective taking, we've explained the phenomena, I believe we kind of need to meet the cognitive psychology view on its own turf first. Then I'm going to review the current behavioral interpretations, and there have been 3, which I will review briefly, with the one that's provided the most contribution coming from relational frame theory. And I will discuss some of the challenges of their current data. And then I will illustrate a potential alternative based on an analysis of verbal behavior. So based on a verbal behavior analysis of the controlling variables of the child who answers certain questions, which is then said to denote theory of mind. And then at the very end, I will show a potential sequence of instruction to establish this complex verbal repertoire in a subset of individuals that have met the prerequisites to access this kind of teaching challenge, and how we can go about breaking down this task, splitting it into various components, and then putting it back together again. So my aim today is very much to focus on the standard test for theory of mind, which is the Salinan false belief task. And I will explain why we focus on that, because it's very much the litmus test for theory of mind. Theory of mind is an accepted phenomenon. It's gone unchallenged in developmental psychology. It's something that does exist and that we all engage in. The question is, can we explain it behaviorally, or do we need to come up with new principles? So let's start with sort of what it is. We kind of all do it. There's not a day that goes by in our daily life where we're not thinking about why and how someone might behave the way they do, or how they feel, and how these kind of feelings and thoughts then lead them to engage in certain actions. And we do this every day. We think about how someone feels, where they, what they're thinking, what are they predicting, and think about something as simple as choosing a gift for a partner. We wouldn't choose it based on what we like, but we choose it based on our partner's preference, which we accept may be different from our own. Or when young children, screech in delight when they are being read for the 10th or 100th time Little Red Riding Hood. What the child is able to do, and why it is so exciting, is that they can track that Little Red Riding Hood's belief about grandma is different from theirs. They know is not grandma, they know is the wolf, but they understand that Little Red Riding Hood doesn't know. When we're reading a detective novel, what is exciting about is being able to track the multiple mental states, the multiple beliefs of the various characters. Those ones have been deceived by the criminal and the detective who puts everybody's motivations and beliefs and false beliefs together and then gets to dissolution. So it is some kind of behavior that we engage in every day at various levels of complexity. And more formally, theory of mind is defined as the ability to attribute independent mental states. And this is the important thing, is one person understands that how I feel, what I believe, or my thinking may be different from someone else's, and it may lead to different actions. And that these mental states may also be different from the current state of the world. You may have a so-called false belief. You may believe that something is what it is when it is actually not. So on a sort of more a different definition by Baron Cohen, who of course was one of the first to define this, was being able to understand that the sort of full range of mental states, not limited to beliefs and desires, but also intentions and emotions, and that these may be different from one's own and they cause action. And we use these concepts to predict and explain people's behavior. So as traditionally construed, theory of mind is cloaked in the language of folk psychology, of mentalistic terminology, starting from the premise that mental states is action. And the traditional task to assess one's ability to distinguish one's own mental state from that of another person, so what someone believes in this case, is the unexpected transfer task. So I'm going to give you an example of this, an everyday example. So the night before, Simon takes the coffee out of the cupboard next to the microwave and loads the machine ready for the following morning. So behaviorally, if I asked you to think about this, what is Simon's reinforcer in the morning? Is coffee, right? After a period of deprivation. So you already know this, that Simon will have in the morning a desire for coffee. You also know what is the discriminative stimulus that is correlated with the availability of coffee for Simon, which is the cupboard next to the microwave. So from this little story, you can already infer, you can tact, you can predict Simon's desire and Simon's belief. We can also call Simon's MO and reinforcer and Simon's discriminative stimulus. But on Monday, while Simon is at work, Janet, the housekeeper, who has a tendency to move things around as she pleases, after cleaning the kitchen, decides that the coffee is better placed in the cupboard above the knives. Okay. Now, you've now been presented with these two correlated events. You also know that Simon still has a desire for coffee, that his current discriminative stimulus for the availability of coffee is the cupboard next to the microwave. But you yourself, if I asked you, where would you look for the coffee? Your discriminative stimulus for the availability of coffee would no longer be the cupboard next to the microwave. It would be the cupboard above the knives. So based on this little story, you make three judgments. One, about Simon's desire, what Simon wants. One, about Simon's belief, that Simon, the coffee, is in the cupboard next to the microwave. And you also make a third judgment. Simon is wrong, that Simon, in fact, has a false belief because the coffee has been moved, right? So there's now a discrepancy in Simon's SD for the availability of coffee and your SD for the availability of coffee, which reflects the current state of the world. Now, remember that a false belief is only false to the observer, not to the believer. To the believer, belief is always true. It is only false to someone else. So this is pretty much what the unexpected transfer task, the item of interest, desire, has been unexpectedly transferred without the person contacting such transfer. And 4-year-olds can accurately predict that Simon, in this case, will look in the last place that has signaled the availability of coffee, right? So they will say, when they're asked, where will Simon look on Tuesday morning for the coffee? They'll say he'll look in the cupboard next to the microwave. But when you ask the average 4-year-old, where is the coffee really, they will say accurately in the cupboard next to knives. And if you ask them, why doesn't Simon know? They'll say, because he did not see the coffee being moved. Okay. So this is a sort of another exemplar of the Sally-Nanfolds belief task, which is a fairly famous task that's based on a previous task that was called the Maxey's task, or the unexpected transfer task. There are two traditional, there have been sort of various iterations and modifications, but these are the two main ways to assess at the earliest level, first order theory of mind, okay? So the task is designed very purposely to disrupt the relationship between one's belief about the current state of the world and the current state of the world, right? So the people which William Perner designed this task was to do this, to evaluate, can the child predict another person's behavior based on what the other person believes, not what the child knows. So they had to devise this task where there was this discrepancy. And one task was the Smarties task. And the other one, the one that's more widely used, is the now called Sally-Nanfolds belief task. So it is very much today considered the litmus test for assessing whether a child, 4-year-old or younger, older, has such a thing as theory of mind. And these tasks have gone many variations, literally hundreds of variations. They've been simplified, control questions have been added, they've been made more complex, they've been presented in a vignette, in a little movie, with puppets, orally. But the results are fairly consistent. And that's why it makes it such an interesting phenomenon, which is children below 4 do not pass the false belief task. They do not, they will respond based on what they see, not based on what the character believes or knows. So children below 4 don't pass the false belief task, and individuals with autism. Not all individuals with autism, clearly, but in general, individuals with autism perform not well on this task, despite having, for example, fairly good language. So theory of mind, though, is not just now, and its related tasks, is not just a test or a way of describing one's ability to predict another person's behavior based on their mental state. It has now become very much a system of reference from which to explain additional social and cognitive processes in both typical and atypical development. In other words, has been very much become a marker for social cognition.
Francesca, can I deliver the first keyword? Sorry to interrupt.
Please, go ahead.
Okay, guys, the first keyword for your CU is Sally, from the girl at the test, as you saw it written in the PowerPoint slides before. Sally, S-A-L-L-Y, the first keyword for your CU. Thank you.
All right. Someone can't see it. You can see the slides? Is that right? Everybody can see the slides because there's someone in chat saying they can't see the slides.
The question was whether we're going to share the slides later.
Oh yeah, that's fine. Yes. Okay. Great. So we now know the sort of traditional definition of theory of mind. I've already given you a bit of a clue about potential behavioral alternative, but we need to go through the behavioral models as well. And well, what about its development? How does it develop? Does it just happen before the child develops theory of mind? Well, of course not. So again, within the traditional developmental lens, the precursors for theory of mind we find in the child below the age of 1, and particularly with joint attention. And joint attention is viewed by some as the first instance of a child monitoring someone's mental state, the mental state of attention. And we know there's a strong correlation between early indicators of autism, and so lack of joint attention, and poor performance on theory of mind tests. Infants are sensitive to the emotional expressions and the matches between the voice and expression. And by 2, they will demonstrate that they understand that people may have different desires and preferences, and they will offer a person a type of food, for example, based on what they say they like. So again, this is seen as a demonstration of an early understanding of people's different desires. And remember, this sort of, main thing about theory of mind is this difference, this discrepancy, the demonstration that a child or person understands that there is a difference in my beliefs and my desires and someone else's, and that this difference will lead to different actions. By 3, they demonstrate to be distinguishing between pretense and reality. They engage in pretty elaborate pretend play. For example, they will pretend to feed food to a dog rather than from an empty bowl. They can predict emotions based on common events. They'll be able to predict that someone may feel sad if their favorite toy is broken. And by 4, they are said to understand the principle that seeing leads to knowing. And for some, this is very much at the heart, the sort of basic mechanism for theory of mind, this idea that they understand that contact, seeing or hearing, leads to knowing, and therefore understand false belief based on that. So this is very roughly sketched the potential sequence of development. Now, what about where do the behavioral interpretations stand? Well, one of the issues that we have as behavior analysts is that it is not an explanation. In this sense, is somewhat circular, and we sort of accuse theory of mind as suffering from the same ailments as pretty much all cognitive interpretations of human behavior, in that behavior is not studied in its own right, but is viewed as an index of some hidden cognitive construct. And the understanding of this cognitive construct then leads to an understanding of behavior. But it's essentially a bit of a circular approach, in that the behavior of interest becomes behavior, is seen as an index of the behavior to be explained. And theory of mind is very much folk psychology at its heart. That's how, at its maximal expression, this is how we have viewed it as behavior analysts, and we have somewhat dismissed it as being too mentalistic. Behavior analysis is not interested in these kinds of processes because they're mentalistic. They suffer from these kinds of problems that pretty much all cognitive psychology suffers from: circularity, the invention of a hypothetical construct, mentalism or mental states explaining behavior rather than focusing on the behavior to be explained and its controlling variables, lack of experimental manipulation and reification, theory of mind as a thing. And that may be true, but if we are going to address or to criticize a cognitive model that's so well accepted, then we have to be able to come up with an alternative, a reasonable behavioral alternative. And I recently gave this presentation. I want to share with you the feedback that I received. I received some lovely feedback from anonymous reviewers. Great presentation, the usual. This was the one that captured, really captured my attention, which was, theory of mind has been left behind by developmental psychology, save for the work of emeritus professors. It feels like BA is trying to slay dead dragons. And I found it quite amusing. And I thought, is that true? Am I sort of, trying to slay a dead dragon? Is it really dead? Is developmental psychology really no longer interested in this? So I just did a little search today. And my answer to this is, I believe theory of mind is very much alive. I just put in Scholar, wrote down theory of mind since papers since 2004. And I got 134,000 entries. Now, not all of them will be applied or experimental papers. Some of them would be reviews and book chapters. I think 134,000 entries tells us that it's not really dead. So maybe we still have, a horse in the race. Maybe we can still provide some contribution to this phenomenon. Which leads us then to, if we want to provide a behavioral alternative, then what does it look like? What does a behavior analysis of theory of mind, of the child engaging, of the behavior of engaging in theory of mind look like? What must a behavior analysis do? Now, some might say, all we need to explain is the conditions under which the term theory of mind is used. And Skinner would say this: we need to explain the conditions under which that term is used, which really is the behavior of the experimenter. What is the experimenter tacting or observing, describing when they're saying, yes, that child is demonstrating theory of mind, that child isn't? I believe that is only half the story. I think we need to be able to define something else, which is we need to also explain the subject's response in terms of its controlling variable. So the question we must be able to answer in behavioral terms is, what is the child actually doing when they're saying to be engaged in theory of mind, to show theory of mind? And we must do so in a manner that is consistent with the developmental literature and the social cognitive changes that the typical child undergoes from infancy to childhood. So we must be able to provide a behavior analysis of all these changes. And if we do that, if we do have an analysis of controlling variables, that's the beauty of behavior analysis, is description, prediction, and control. We describe the phenomenon, we predict under which conditions we're going to observe it, because we understand the controlling variables, and then we can manipulate these controlling variables for the process to emerge, for the behavior, however complex it is, to emerge. So if our analysis works and we've identified the controlling variables, we can break it down and recreate those conditions into a teaching sequence. So in terms of the behavior analytic contributions, there are three main contributions. The most extensive contribution was provided and continues to be provided by the proponents of relational frame theory. What all these three models have in common is that they switch from the term theory of mind to perspective taking. But again, perspective taking, although yes, it's kind of behaviorized, we kind of put a verb ending at the end, it doesn't really explain it. What does it mean to take on someone's perspective? So let's look at the first model very, very briefly. So perspective taking, as pretty much everything else, is seen as an example of relational responding. But it is somewhat different from the other frames in that, although it adds to the body of the family of frames such as distinction and coordination, oppositions and comparison, the sort of difference is that the frame of perspective is an example of a dytic relational frame in which the relation is specified in the terms of the perspective of the speaker. And there's sort of three relevant frames to a dytic frame of perspective taking: the I and you relation, the here and there, and the now and then. So if you think of the Simon's example, it would be Simon versus me. The here and there would be now covered by the microwave, covered by the knives, and the now and then would be Monday night, Tuesday morning. Okay. So the relevant frames are these across varying level of relational complexity, from simple to reversed to double reversed. And the way this came about is that Louise Mayhew and colleagues, Yvonne Barnes-Holmes and Irma Barnes-Holmes, wrote this paper in which they developed a developmental profile based on manual by Patricia Howling, Julie Howden, and Sam Barker. You may know it. It's Teaching Children with Autism to Mind Read, where they explain various levels of theory of mind from 1 to 5. And so what Mayhew et al. They did is they developed a series of tasks actually based on Yvonne Barnes-Holmes. It's really her protocol that then was researched and investigated. And the protocol goes through basically, resume slideshow, a number of scenarios that can be presented either through a computer or verbally. And this is one example. So think of it, this is the antecedent event where I'm saying, I am sitting in the blue chair, you are sitting in the black chair. The simple relation would require the child to answer these questions, which we could look at them as conditional discriminations. Where are you sitting versus where am I sitting? So that would be a simple relation. A reversed relation would require the child to answer these verbal antecedents. If I were you and you were me, where would I be sitting? Where would you be sitting? In a double reverse relation, the antecedent remains the same. So it's still, I am sitting in the blue chair, you're sitting in the black chair, but this is the additional verbal antecedent that would be provided. I'm sitting here on the blue chair and you're sitting down the black chair. If I was you and you were me, and if here was there and there was here, where would I be sitting? Where would you be sitting? Now, as with most RFT tasks, this is the basic frame. And then you can change the terms in between. So the individual task. So it could be, I am wearing a black top, Thanos is wearing a gray top. If Thanos was me and I were him, what would I be wearing? What would he be wearing? Right? So we have kind of a fixed frame, and then the variable elements, which will be the multiple exemplars that can be changed. And so the traditional training is you train on one set, and then you test the same structure frame with novel exemplars. Now, when according to McHugh et al., from an RFT perspective, responding correctly to these questions requires a double reversed frame or relation. It requires the ability to derive relations in accordance with these dytic frames of IU, here and there, now and then, in accordance with logical knot as follows. Did not see inside that and then, but I do see inside here and now. So if we take the equivalence language to perspective taking, sort of the RFT view, the frame of perspective task stands very much in the same way the false belief task stands for theory of mind. So they're allegedly equivalent. So perspective, derived relational responding in terms of the didactic frame of perspective is the same as theory of mind. The frame of perspective task is equivalent to the false belief task. What we should see, if these are really tapping into the same mechanism, is that passing one test, the frame of perspective task, or learning the frame of perspective task, would lead to passing the false belief task, because they're essentially equivalent mechanisms. But this does not happen. So, a couple of things. The developmental profile was developed across a range of age groups, from early childhood, so children between 3 and 5, middle childhood, late childhood, adolescents, and adults. And these tasks was presented across the 3 levels of frame complexity. So as discussed, so simple, reversed, and double reversed. Now remember that the double reversed is the one that's allegedly required to pass false belief task, which the average 4-year-old passes, right? If these tasks are equivalent, what we should see is, granted, perhaps the children in the early childhood would make a lot of errors, but we would not expect adults to make errors on these tasks, on the frame of perspective tasks, certainly not middle childhood, children who pass strange stories and second order false belief tasks. So the question is it really the same mechanism? Has this model sufficiently explained it? So adults make substantial errors in 2 of the 3 frames said to be required, as do the younger groups. And if the tasks are equivalent, then training on these frames should produce, when tested, passing the false belief tasks. However, in a recent review, the authors conclude that there is little evidence of a relationship between didactic relational responding and improved performance on traditional perspective-taking tasks. So the question is, are they really tapping into the same phenomenon? Or if you think about the language requirements of false belief tasks, it's very simple. The language requirement is very low. An average 4-year-old will pass it. The language requirement, the level of listener and behavior and speaker behavior required to pass double reverse frame of perspective task is much more complex. So are we looking at the same thing? Or are we looking at perhaps a level of structural or conditional discrimination complexity that your average 4-year-old would not have access to? Now, the second model is perspective take. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. Just to deliver the second keyword.
Please.
Guys, for those of you with the CUs, our second keyword is false. As we say, false belief. Our second keyword is false. Thank you.
All right. So the second model, this was an interesting paper, very recent paper, and Taylor and Edwards challenge, the main focus of the paper is really a challenge to the RFT model. But they conclude, or they propose, that we can view perspective taking as a type of problem-solving behavior involving the prediction of what others will do or are currently doing privately. Now, if you are familiar with what problem-solving behavior involves, it really involves, what does it mean to solve a problem? It means you're presented with an event for which you have no immediate behavior, and you engage in additional self-supplementary behavior to produce a solution. So that supplementary behavior is called precurrent behavior that leads then to the solution of the problem behavior, which is called the current behavior. So let me give you a very simple example. If I asked you, tell me what 35 plus 72 is, you have no immediate behavior. The response is not only programmed for reinforcement, it is within your repertoire. you can achieve that response by engaging in additional behavior. So you may break the number down. You may do, okay, 5 plus 2 is 7, and 30 plus 70 is 100. Okay, the answer is 107. But you can see that it wasn't immediate. You had to engage in additional self-supplemented VB to get to the solution. So we have behavior at time 1. In this case, we're observing where Sally puts the ball, and that's pre-current behavior, and behavior at time 2, predicting where Sally will look. And behavior at time 2 can only occur if the subject has contacted the event at time 1. So according to the authors, it requires a history of speaker and listener, event recall, and a history of predicting that people will look for items and blah, 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 as well as responding to gestures and gaze. So a whole list of behaviors that are not fully accounted for behaviorally. And all these pre-current behaviors together then participate in the current response. Now, while it is true that we can define recalling, and the Sally and Ann false belief task is an example of recall in a sense, as problem-solving behavior. So behavior at time 2 that is dependent upon having contacted an event at time 1, that's no longer that. It tells us very little about the kind of distinctive characteristics of theory of mind problem solving versus any other kind of recall problem solving type behavior. So in other words, I will argue that theory of mind type tasks may involve some recall, and we can define all recall as problem solving. But in this particular paper, the answer of exactly what kind of problem solving behavior is the child engaged in when we speak of theory of mind has not yet been fully answered. Other than they observe, they contact an event, and then they recall the event. But there's something quite specific about recalling in a false belief task versus recalling a simple story. So the third model, which is, I think, the one that gets slightly closer to an analysis of the controlling variable. So that's what a behavioral explanation must do. It is not sufficient to simply translate from cognitive to verbs. It must provide a full account for it to be an explanation of the controlling variables involved. So Spradley and Braley suggest that this kind of phenomenon comes about from children observing and people looking for things and describing people in these kinds of situations where they look for things and they can't find them. And it involves a number of skills, particularly imitation. But the main thing that they get to is that the success on false belief tasks necessitates discrimination. And they're really the first ones to address this in this way between the stimuli available to the child. So think about it, the SDs available to the child and those available to the protagonist. And so that's why I think they're getting closer, that they recognize that the discriminative cues from oneself are different. The child recognizes that these discriminative cues are different. But this is where they stop. And I believe then that an analysis of the verbal behavior and answering what is it that the child is actually doing? What are they, when we're talking about discriminating, what is the child doing? And I would argue that the child is actually tacting controlling variables and discriminating one's controlling variables from those of another. And that's why verbal behavior, I believe, knits all this together. So this is what we want to be able to achieve. We've defined theory of mind from the mainstream perspective, presented the 3 models. Let's see whether a verbal behavioral analysis contributes, enhances our understanding, and perhaps can sort of bring these models together. So we're going to start with the basic cognitive premises that mental states cause behavior. So we start from that. So we meet them on their own definition. And I believe that we can continue to maintain the term theory of mind without necessarily sort of adding verbs. We just need to examine what it is that the child is doing. So we start from the premise that as humans, we do this all the time. We don't go about our daily life talking about contingencies and controlling variables and SDs and MOs and SRs, and we're talking to sort of, your neighbor, your partner who may not be a behavior analyst. We say, I'm frustrated and I behaved that way because I was frustrated, I was angry. So we use mentalistic explanations all the time in our daily life. And we're constantly attempting to explain why people do what they do, based really on recognizing their beliefs, thoughts, and desires. And we understand that they're different from ours. So if we start from the premise that seeing leads to knowing, and that theory of mind is the prediction of behavior based on mental states. So mental states cause behavior. The two basic mental states, the earliest mental states, are desires and beliefs that cause action. Now, think about it behaviorally. What is a desire? So when the child is engaging in theory of mind behavior, they are doing so by understanding one's desire and mental state. Understanding means acting at the sort of basic level. What is a desire and behavior analysis? So we know that these things don't cause action. Controlling variables do. There are two controlling variables, MOs and SDs. So we can say that theory of mind, rather than being predicting one's action based on an understanding of their desire and beliefs, is tacting the probability of behavior based on tacting one's MO, reinforcer, and discriminative stimuli. In other words, it's what we do when we're doing a behavior analysis. What is it when we're doing a functional analysis of behavior? Not necessarily of challenging behavior. We are tacting MOs and SDs. And I believe that is what theory of mind is essentially. It is understanding another person's controlling variables with an additional part, which is discriminating those controlling variables from our own. So what are MOs? Changes in a momentary value of a reinforcer. So when we're saying I'm understanding your motivation, we're saying I'm engaging in verbal behavior regarding your current EO and SR. This is what you're doing. When I asked you, what is it that Simon wants? You're tacting Simon's current reinforcer based on having contacted some information about it. When we're saying they're understanding beliefs, right? What is a belief? It's the tendency to behave under certain conditions. So when we're saying someone understands one's belief, is I'm engaging in verbal behavior about one's propensity to behave in the presence of certain stimuli. And that based on having contacted these two pieces of information, I can then predict behavior and discriminate that these two pieces of information are different. So let's kind of work it out in behavioral terms and break down the Sally-Nanfolds belief task. This is the event. So you're the child, okay? Now, Anne is a distractor, right? Anne is just there to demonstrate, to create an event for which that ball is moved, okay? The main character is Sally. So this is the child, you're the child. So we know that Sally's reinforcer is the ball, okay? And she puts it in the basket. So what you're tacting now is Sally's SD, right? This is a child, Sally. So these two things we keep in mind all the time. So if the child is observing this, that Sally puts the ball in the basket, the SD for Sally is the basket. For the child, the SD for the ball, for the availability of the ball as a reinforcer, is the basket. Okay? So here there's a match. There's concordance between Sally's SD and the child's SD. Now, Anne moves the ball and puts it in the box. Now, the child is watching this. So child tags basket here. Now, remember the tag for Sally was the basket. Now, Sally does not contact the ball in the basket. The child can't, the ball in the box. The child does contact the ball in the box. So now the child can track that there are two different SDs at work. Can tag that Sally's SD for the ball is the basket, but their own SD for the ball is the box. So if you ask them, where will Sally look? They will answer based on Sally SD. But if you ask the control question, where is the ball really, or where would you look? I would look in the box. So I would argue that in this case, what we're observing is tacting behavior on the tendency to behave for Sally based on having previously contacted that person's controlling variables. So we can rework theory of mind in behavioral terms by saying, I know that Sally doesn't know that Anne moved the ball from the basket to the box because Sally did not see Anne move it, hence Sally will look in the box. That's how the typical child would answer, not in this kind of convoluted way, but if you broke it down, this is what they would say. Now, the behavioral savvy child may say, I can contact, see, or hear that Sally puts the ball in the box. The discriminative stimulus for Sally regarding her reinforcer is the basket. Sorry, there's a, I can kind of Sally puts the ball in the box. There's an error here, which doesn't make it make sense, but let me just, I've just noticed it. Okay, so it should be, I can contact that Sally puts the ball in the box. The discriminative stimulus for Sally regarding her reinforcer is the box, okay, or the basket, depending where Sally puts it. I can contact that Anne moves the ball from the basket to the box. I can contact that Sally does not contact this. My discriminative stimulus for the ball is X. Sally's discriminative stimulus for the ball is Y. So we can redefine it in terms of acting the environmental variables that are controlling another person's behavior and discriminating between source of stimulus control of that person and one's own. So the child is contacting Sally's current SD. So I'm going to show you, based on this, how we can break it down. But I would ask that you agree not to take photographs or videos of what you're going to see now. I want to protect children's identity. There's a preferential orienting to social stimuli, which means that social stimuli, and in particular the eyes of people, where people look, are incredibly relevant, and they become both reinforcers and discriminative stimuli in the very few months of life. And verbal behavior in the typical child is acquired through interaction with social stimuli, because social stimuli have acquired where people look, what people say, the facial expressions, both reinforcing and discriminative functions. So verbal behavior is generally acquired and maintained through social interaction. And verbal behavior, if you look at the content of verbal behavior, is really about people's activities, what they do, where and when. So they often involve verbal behavior about public events that involve people. And from then on, the child, if you read Skinner, provides an analysis of how this develops. Verbal behavior moves from public events to private events and their correlated activities. And from then on, verbal behavior may then move to acting other people's controlling variables and differentiating them from one's own. So I don't have time to explain all of this, but this is a potential sequence, which means that if we get to this point, we need to have all this. So we need to have a behavioral repertoire to the point that the child can say, how do you know? Because I can see. How do you know? Because I can hear. So they engage in this autocritic frame about the control. What is it in the environment that's controlling their behavior? So where do we start? Well, the first thing that we might want to teach is for the child to match the sensory modality with the stimulus, and to be able to explain how they can contact something. How do they know something? Because they can contact it or not. So this idea that contact leads to knowing would be our first step. And then from that, we would move to third person. So let me show you an example.
Francesca, give me just a
Yeah.
sec so I can stop the recording, and also to deliver the last keyword, because I'm aware that some folks might need to go. So folks, the last keyword is number 9, as we say 7, 8, 9. So the last keyword for your CU is number 9. I will quickly put in the chat the CU form again, in case some people didn't access it originally. So hopefully you will now be able to see it. Please click on this so it sits in your browser for those of you that might need to go. And we have about 40 days to send you the certificate. So don't worry if you don't get it straight away. I usually do them before the next behavioral talk. So just bear with me and I will sort them quickly as soon as I can. This is also a feedback form if any of you need to give us feedback before you go. Now, let me stop the recording so Francesca can share the next video.
So the first thing that we want to teach the child is to someone saw before and the stimulus hasn't changed, and that person still knows, even though the stimulus may have changed. So I'm going to show you just the last video and then we'll close. This is after this training, baseline again. Mind essentially involves tacting someone else's controlling variables, SDs and SRs, and discriminating them from one's own. Involves basically teaching that discrimination of one's seeing, your seeing, and matching, or hearing, not hearing, and matching the sense modality to the type of source of, to the stimulus that's being presented, and whether you can tact or not tact based on whether your source of stimulus control is blocked or not. And then adding the temporal part. So once the social precursors are in place, then these behavioral processes are fairly straightforward. And you saw the zero latency with which kids replied. There was no gray supplementary mediation or behavior. They just answered based on a discrimination between their own controlling variables and that of one's SD and that of their own. So I believe that this is essentially what theory of mind is basically conducting a functional analysis of a person's behavior. And as with everything that's theoretical, the proof is in the pudding, as in its practical application. And I believe this is where ABA has an advantage compared to a more theoretical behavioral approach, is that it can then provide us with a better understanding of the variables involved in this type of process. And a good theory does exactly that. It provides practical solutions to a problem. And in this sense, we can meet both the conceptual and the technological aspects of applied behavior analysis. Thank you.
Well, Francesca, we still have 50 plus people who've stayed, so I think that
Thank you.
that shows that there was interest in what you were discussing. Thank you very much. That was very, very interesting, and I'm sure people enjoyed it. Guys, a couple of very quick questions. If you have any, please type them away in the chat, and I'm happy to read them out, Francesca. For those of you that need to go, I've already posted the link, but I will post it again. So this is the CEU form. for the 3 keywords, and this is the feedback form for the session. Some people are saying wonderful information as always, Francesca. From Stacy and Mandy. I assume you would know who that is.
Yeah, I do know. I'm reading the chat,
Okay.
and it's lovely to hear your comments. I'm happy to share the slides. The paper, if accepted, will probably come out at some point next year. The paper, as I've intended to write it, does have the full teaching sequence with the pictures as well, which were especially drawn by an artist. It will have all of that, and I know people are interested in the sequence. I do have to say a couple of things. Is what I've done is I've just broken down the task, but it doesn't mean that the children will demonstrate that they can pass this task, that they don't maintain the sort of critical characteristics of learners who struggle with these kinds of tasks. So past this, these kinds of verbal behavior will need to be honed and applied in lots of different situations during conversation. Well, if you say this, how will your friend feel? What will they think? What must they do? What might they do? So this is a first step, but at least it gives you a blueprint of, from then you can build on complexity, but we need to start somewhere. So this is a stepping stone, is not sort of, the end of the process. But I think anything we can do to help individuals with autism who do struggle to put themselves in someone's shoes, strategies to do that, then the better they will be able to navigate the complexity and the nuances of the social world. And this is just the first step, but it might provide you with some coherent framework from which to build on.
Some people are saying thank you. I have one question, so I will ask quickly this one. Where do you, what applications can you foresee going forward in the future?
I mean, I think we have to accept that this is typical kids get this way without any teaching, is just part of their day-to-day. So the way, just the fact that we're breaking it down and teaching specific strategies alters that path. And I guess what I would like to see is, one is some research on this, because actually all I have is clinical data and data from our research program at Southampton, which we haven't published the individual data, and it's old, and I don't know that we ever will. So I would like to see some, someone picking up this protocol and actually testing it, maybe in their master's thesis or PhD thesis. I'm happy to share everything that I have. In my experience, kids, what they learn to do is to self-talk. So when they're struggling, first they need to recognize that there's something here they're not understanding, and then kind of ask themselves these questions. Did they know? Did they hear that the venue changed? No, they didn't. Then, because they didn't hear that the venue changed, they might go to the wrong place. Let me ring them, or let me call them and let them know that the venue has changed. So in that sense, now, theory of mind has often been linked, perspective taking, to empathy. And it is true that if you don't put yourself into someone's shoes, then you can't demonstrate empathy in that sense. So sort of some kind of behavior to alleviate someone's suffering, because you don't see it, because you can't contact what it is that's making someone feel a particular way. So I think it might also give us an initial understanding or stepping stone towards sort of, again, navigating the sort of difficulties of the social world. And I don't think it's just individuals with autism who sometimes find it difficult to figure out what it is that people are thinking. But for sort of neurotypical individuals, that bit more intuitive, and is really sort of finding those strategies. So it may give us a better understanding of the components of certain complex social cognitive, social cognition. And I think behavior analysis is well placed to do that, as well as perhaps some therapeutic strategies to relieve some of the social anxiety that many individuals do feel under these kinds of conditions. But again, it's all at the moment, you know, where it is very, very early work.
Okay. Thank you. Some of you, I know I saw a couple of people raising their hands, and I have a question. If someone can ask a question out loud, I'm not ignoring you, but it would take a while for me to change the settings. And for those of you who've joined the talk for the first time, keep in mind, we have cameras and mics off because historically we had some toddlers that accidentally switched on their mom's cameras while they were attending the talk. And because this is going to go up on YouTube, we're just making sure that people cannot switch mics and cameras on for that. So I apologize if some of you want to ask a question out loud, but I cannot. It would take a while for me to change the settings now on Teams for you to be able to do so. Okay, I have a last question, but I need a quick answer because I need to finish. Did individuals that performed well on the frame of perspective tasks perform better on perspective-taking tasks? Am I understanding that the difference to RFT, quote unquote, trying to teach this is the fact that individuals can access compound stimuli, visual and verbal, during their learning, and they're not sure if they're explaining themselves well?
From better on perspective-taking tasks. It's a good question. Actually, no. So there were very few studies. That of the 7 studies that I specifically looked at this, I believe only one actually tested for perspective. For perspective-taking tasks. So not frames of perspective, but lit the Salinan and showed no change. Which the other 6 studies, so there's no link, there's no correlation currently. The other studies showed improvement in the frames of perspective tasks. So in a way, they trained for those tasks and then showed good performance on the sort of tests of generalization for those tasks. But teaching on those so far has not been demonstrated to lead to passing sort of perspective-taking tasks in the Salinan false belief task. So that's one of the challenges, I think, to this account. I believe the answer is in the complexity of the task. I think the language requirements are far too complex for your average 4- and 5-year-old. And the fact that even adults struggle with those is indicative of perhaps the complexity of the task. I don't know that they're really tapping into the same phenomenon. But again, they tackled a difficult issue when nobody else did and did the experiments. And that's, you know, regardless of what my position is in terms of a verbal behavior account versus an RFT account, I commend the authors because, you know, the other sort of behavior subfield has pretty much dismissed it and said, it's too mentalistic, it doesn't interest us. But I believe if we want to have place at the mainstream table of understanding human behavior, then these are the phenomena we need to tackle, is the complex ones.
Absolutely, and I think that's an excellent way to end today's behavioral talk. Francesca, thank you again for joining us. I really hope we will host you again in the future. We love your work, you know this, we love your research, and I can see that people are enthusiastic about it in the chat as well. So guys, keep an eye out for the paper. Generally, when you see the name Degil Espinosa, I recommend you read the paper. That's what I do. And as I was telling Francesca the other day, I've got some other nice papers that I'm hoping to add to our syllabus that have resulted from her work. For example, one on token economies that was recently published. So check that out as well. Okay, thank you, everybody. Take care, and I will see you all around. Thanks, Francesca. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.